Greetings. We're continuing in Mark chapter 10 and coming to the conclusion of the section of intensive discipleship training, which Jesus is engaged in with his disciples. And that takes up part of Mark 8 and all of chapters 9 and 10. And as we've seen, it's bracketed between a healing miracle where a man at first only sees foggily as people as trees walking, and then the conclusion where someone else who needs healing for blindness sees more than clearly. But that's for next time. Today, the final part of the discipleship training. The passage is Mark 10:35 to 45. Once or twice before, if you're regular viewers of these little talks, you'll notice that I get a bit cross with the compilers of the lectionary, those who prepare the readings that most churches use on a 3-year cycle each Sunday. And basically the lectionary is a very good idea, taking us through just about all 4 Gospels and much of the rest of New Testament and Old Testament writing. If we're in one of those churches where for the main Sunday service you have an Old Testament reading, a New Testament one, and a Gospel, which I think is a good pattern, with a psalm as well, is an excellent pattern. And the 3-year cycle, which many churches use or recommend or suggest to their clergy and ministers, is a very good thing. But sometimes it irks me rather a lot, as this time, where we read Mark 10:35 to 45, we should be reading Mark 10:32 to 45, but those first 3 verses, 32, 33, and 34, are omitted, probably because the compilers of the lectionary think it's a bit repetitive, because this is the third of 3 occasions in just 3 chapters where Jesus talks about what's going to happen to him when they get to Jerusalem. They're on the way, on the road, and Mark uses that word road or way, differently translated in English, but the same word in the original all the time. Mark uses it as very much a sign of the way to Jerusalem, the way, the cross, the decision to leave Galilee and head for Jerusalem, knowing what will be. And 3 times in these 2.5 chapters, Jesus says what's going to happen in Jerusalem. And the third one, the lectionary compilers have omitted because it's a bit tedious saying the same thing 3 times, isn't it? Well, I'm going to look at it very briefly because it introduces today's passage. Today's passage is a super phenomenal, important piece of Mark's Gospel, but it makes a lot more sense if you read it in the light of what comes immediately before. It makes even more devastating sense. The thing about these 3 predictions of what will happen in Jerusalem is that they're not identical. They vary. You could very sensibly, for a whole series of talks, put them alongside each other and look at the similarities and the differences. You could even, if you want, look at the similarities and the differences where they occur in other Gospels as well. But here Mark has the 3 very clearly and clearly different from each other in certain ways. And that's important. It's important for all sorts of reasons, not least because they're coming to the conclusion of the discipleship training. He gives more detail about what's going on, and he makes it clear that it's the Gentiles ultimately, at the whim or wish or demand of the Jewish leaders, it's Gentiles who actually put Jesus to death. There's a whole balance and spread of that. Who is responsible for Jesus' death? If you put all three of these together, you discover that it's everyone, the whole of humanity, who's responsible for Jesus' death. And you've got more detail of the torture and what will happen in this third one. You've also got, just before it, the context of verse 32, that the disciples are amazed. This is his previous teaching of how hard it is for rich people and for others to enter the kingdom of God, because he demands our whole selves, in discipleship. Discipleship isn't a hobby, it's a total life commitment. And the disciples are amazed at this, and those who followed, the wider group, there are more than just the 12, and they're sometimes distinguished as here. Those who followed were afraid. What Jesus is doing and calling people to is something stark and unheard of as far as they're concerned. Can we walk along the way on the road to Jerusalem with this man, if that's what he's demanding of us, such total allegiance? Well, he takes the 12 aside and tells them in more detail. The others are afraid already. No need to get them even more so. But he insists to the 12 how bad it really will be, because he is going to Jerusalem and he's going to be handed over and ill treated and put to death by the Gentiles, which is even worse. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise again. They don't get it, but they remember it. That's the background. Then in today's passage, Mark 10:35, James and John, sons of Zebedee, come forward and say to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." We get Peter, James, and John mentioned as a threesome from time to time, for example, at the Transfiguration, and they seem to be the leaders of the disciples of the 12, the apostles. But here's the only occasion we get James and John mentioned, and the name of their father Zebedee is mentioned too. You've got that early on in when they're called to be disciples. They're sometimes called the sons of thunder, which is what Zebedee can mean, but it's their nickname. And here, well, something about it going on. Something about that very strong description, nickname for them. We want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. That's a bit much, isn't it? And he asks them, what is it you want me to do for you? Now, note that question, because it's going to come again exactly the same way in next week's little passage. What is it you want me to do for you? And they say to him, grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. Now, they may have been put up to this by their mother. We read that elsewhere, all sorts of background possibilities. One thing is clear, they believe that Jesus is in some way the king and that he will sit on a throne in glory. That's something. That's a high degree of faith. They believe very highly of Jesus, and they want something of it, something out of it, for following him, for being the leaders of the disciples. So they've excluded Peter, but Peter's not going to be happy about that. And if Peter is the one who is giving Mark most of his information, as the earliest Christian writers believed, it makes a lot of sense that he is telling this story, if you like, against James and John. Now, in the context of Jesus' prediction of what's going to happen in Jerusalem, this is really important, because each time Jesus has predicted what's going to happen in Jerusalem, the disciples have got it wrong. The first time was when Peter himself said, "No, this can't happen." And Jesus has to say, "Get behind me, Satan." And the second time he does it, again, the disciples are misunderstanding, and misunderstanding in quite a bad way. We've left everything for you. What's our reward going to be? And this third time, well, very, very specific. This is the reward we want. Possibly we even get that bad things are going to happen to you, but you're going to be on your throne in some way. We'll ignore the bad bits. You're going to be on your throne. We believe that, Jesus. You're the Lord, you're the Messiah, you're the King. We want to be next to you on the places of highest honor. And there's stuff in all sorts of Jewish teaching and the teaching of the Jewish rabbis that when the teacher or the leader is there, he's in the middle, and on his right and left hand are his second and third in command, those who are with him as joint leaders in effect. They've heard something of Jesus' greatness, but they haven't actually heard what he's really saying, or to use Mark's picture language for this discipleship training, they haven't seen the truth. They're like the man who is healed at Bethsaida in chapter 8, who sees but not clearly. And they're going to be contrasted next time, a little spoiler, with someone who sees clearly, both before and after his blindness is healed. Jesus asks them, he says, "You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." The cup that I drink, they ought to be back in the Old Testament. They ought to be thinking in terms of what the cup might mean. Might this mean the cup of God's wrath? The cup of judgment on sin? Go back to the Old Testament, think through what that cup might be before being so ready. As they say, "We are able." Then Jesus says, "The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I'm baptized, you will be baptized." Baptism symbolizes death to sin. Baptism symbolizes the fire of God's judgment. Baptism symbolizes dying and rising again. But baptism isn't a big thing yet, but he mentions it. And will you be able to go through what I have to go through? Yes, we're able. The cup you will drink, the baptism you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, it's for those for whom it has been prepared. Not mine to grant, God's gift. He's been quite gracious with them. He's not laying into them the way he does to Peter when Peter says, you can't go the way of the cross. It's not that harsh, but we just read this and we're meant to be slightly appalled, because he's been teaching them so much in these 3 chapters and they're still blind. They still don't get it. They still don't get that discipleship is about following Jesus. And following Jesus is not about glory. It's first about suffering. And they haven't got that. But then human nature reasserts itself. Verse 41, when the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. Yep, so they might. They're excluded from the inner cabinet, which James and John want to be part of. Even Peter is excluded in their thinking. So Jesus called them and said to them, you know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. Dictators sitting on a throne with a couple of senior lackeys next to them. Here's the rebuke. That is the rebuke for James and John. It's a severe one. It's Gentiles who look for that sort of glory and lordship and rule and dominion. It's Gentiles who see kingship as a matter of power and authority and being in charge. As he's saying, without quite saying it, you James and John, you're behaving like Gentiles. And he's saying to the rest, if you're cross because James and John have got in there first with this request, and you resent their asking for it, then you're behaving like Gentiles too. And you're blind, the lot of you. He doesn't use that particular description. He doesn't need to, because this is between the healing at Bethsaida and the healing which will happen next time at Jericho. It's not so among you. Interesting, verse 43. It is not so among you. You aren't those who want to lord it over people and who think that kingship is a matter of power. Not so with you. Well, of course, it is so with them. It's precisely what they want. But he doesn't use any sort of future tense. He doesn't say it will not be like that with you. He doesn't even say it should not be like that with you. What he's saying is, I'm training you as disciples. You're kingdom people. In this new world that you are entering, the world of walking the way of the cross, the world of being my disciple, the world of following me as king, in that world that you are entering and wishing to be part of, there is no place for this. This idea of kingship as authority and power isn't part of that world. It isn't the world you've chosen. It isn't like that. Now, they've made it like that. They're still living in the old world. They're maybe half a foot in the kingdom and only 1.5 feet back behind them. But it is not so. It is not so. If you're on a discipleship course, that isn't how you think and behave. Now, it is how they're thinking and behaving, but he tells them, no, if you're on this road, not so, not how you think. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. He's going to use 2 different words here, servant and slave. Servant is pretty menial. Slave is even more so. Won't go into questions of slavery at the moment. That's for other occasions. Whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. That's the kingdom. That's discipleship. The great are those who serve, and the greatest are those who serve in the most menial way. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. This is the heart of discipleship, understanding who Jesus is and why he came, seeing the truth about Jesus and living that out in our lives is the heart of discipleship. Discipleship is about seeing Jesus and following him. Simple as that. And seeing Jesus, well, to use the story from Mark's Gospel, he's the one who washes the disciples' feet. He's the one who is there to serve, not to be served. He is the one who becomes the most menial, the slave. And how does he do that? Because he came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, there's a little word here, or it's a big word, ransom, which is rare in precisely this form. It's an emphatic form of a particular Greek word that's used. It only occurs twice in the New Testament, and it has a very, very, very clear meaning. It's a substitute payment. It's a buying back. That which has been taken, stolen, claimed, is in the wrong place. Buying back, ransom, substitute. He came to give his life a ransom for many. He came to pay the price for the freeing of many. Many doesn't mean, let's limit it. How many exactly is many? Is it 144,000 or any other strange number that we want to come up with? No, many means in the context of all this, it means Jews, Gentiles, whatever divisions you make in your dividing up of people, men, women, in our culture, black, white, any whatever distinctions you choose to make, slave or free, is a big biblical distinction. Many across the board, not making distinctions. We're not excluding here. Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom across the board. There are many Christian thinkers, teachers, and ordinary Christians who have tried to wriggle away from that word ransom. There are some who don't like it. This is about the Father accepting the sacrifice of the Son in place of others, a substitute, what theologically is sometimes called substitutionary atonement, and some don't like it. It's been described by some who don't like it as cosmic child abuse, the Father punishing the innocent Son for the sins of others. This is Jesus choosing. It's what he came to do, what he came to be. You take this away and you've lost the heart of the gospel. It's a difficult word. It's a challenging word. Please note, Jesus says it before Paul teaches it. That's the right way round. This may not be the way we'd want it, but it's the way of God's grace, that sin must be punished. The price must be paid, and Jesus willingly pays it. And when people turn away from that as a doctrine, they're turning away from the centrality of the cross. And in practical terms, they're turning away from the heart of discipleship, because we're called to walk with Jesus and be willing to walk all that way with Jesus. It can be a tough one, or it can be a glorious one, that Jesus is our ransom and he pays the price, and that the Old Testament pictures of sacrificial lambs and goats and so on are simply working up to this and preparing us for this moment where Jesus becomes the Lamb of God, the sacrifice who is slain, the Passover lamb who is slain for us. And that's why he came, to give his life as a ransom for many. It's, of course, at the heart of the gospel, like it or not. And when you realize his love for us, it's more than like it. It's love it. It's fall before his feet in worship. But the point he's making here is that it's the pattern of true discipleship. It's walking God's way. It's the way we're called. So James and John, instead of asking to be at the right and left of the throne, the question you should be asking is, what can I do to give myself for others? How can I follow you, Jesus, as the King who's a servant? Jesus says, you will drink the cup I drink, and the baptism with which I'm baptized, you will be baptized. John and James, funny pair, these brothers. James was martyred. John, as far as we know, seems to have been the only one of the 12, apart from Judas Iscariot, the only one not to have been martyred. But John was called to serve and to suffer. And John was the only one of the 12, we're told, who was stood there at the foot of the cross, seeing his Lord and Master suffering for him. Drinking the cup and being baptized with Jesus' baptism doesn't necessarily mean martyrdom, but it means standing in awe and horror at the foot of the cross and seeing him slain, innocent for us, guilty. It means walking with him and, as it were, being sprinkled with the blood and accepting what he's done as his gift, because he came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And that's what discipleship is about. And that's why in this intense teaching on discipleship, Jesus 3 times tells them what's going to happen to him. Because being my disciple means learning from me, walking this way, all through his ministry, of course, but particularly the final months of his ministry when he sets his face towards Jerusalem and heads that way, beginning in some ways at the feeding of the 5,000 at Passover time, a year before his actual death, but particularly in the last 6 months or so as he's doing this intensive teaching. He's had a spell of Gentile ministry before that, clearly described in Mark's Gospel. But during this whole time, walking the way of the cross is looking to the cross, knowing what's going to happen, knowing that Jesus walking the way of the cross knows what's going to happen. And in increasing detail over these 3 occasions, he describes what's going to happen. And he's saying, walk with me, and understand. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. And don't be asking for what your reward will be. Ask for how you will serve, how you can serve. That's following Jesus, not seeking the reward or the honor or any sort of popularity or glory or high position or esteem or big title or anything like that. But asking with Jesus, how can I serve? How can I give my life in this cause for these people, for this King, following this Lord? Amen.